Greetings and welcome to another episode of the Business Talk podcast. I am your host Deepak from India. It is a truly honor to have Dr. Jennifer Clapp with us, Tier 1 Canada Research Chair in Global Food Security and Sustainability and Professor in the School of Environment, Resources and Sustainability at the University of Waterloo. Her expertise is invaluable to our conversation today. Dr. Jennifer's work illuminates the structural forces reshaping global food systems. Her research examines how financial markets, corporate consolidation, and trade politics intersect with food security and environmental sustainability. As a member of the International Panel of Experts on Sustainable Food Systems and the UN Food Systems Coordination Hub's Scientific Advisory Committee, she translates this research into actionable policy guidance for global decision makers. Dr. Clapp's scholarly outputs reflect deep engagement with food systems' most pressing challenges. Recent publications, including Titans of Industrial Agriculture, published by MIT Press, Speculative Harvest on Financialization, Hunger in the Balance on Food Assistance Politics, and multiple editions of Food. Her recognition as a Royal Society of Canada Fellow, recipient of the 2018 Ines Guerin Medal, a 2013 Trudeau Fellow, and an International Fellow of the Swedish Royal Academy of Agriculture and Forestry reflects the significance of her contributions to food systems, scholarship, and policy. In this episode, Dr. Jennifer Clapp explores the critical theme from her new book, Titans of Industrial Agriculture, revealing how corporate consolidation has reshaped the global farm sector and why it matters. So without further delay, let's welcome Dr. Jennifer Clapp to the conversation. Dr. Clapp, we are deeply grateful for accepting our invitation. It's a genuine honor to welcome you to our podcast.
Thank you very much. I'm really happy to be here today.
Thank you. Professor, you trace corporate dominance in agriculture inputs back over a century. What were the pivotal moments or turning points in the early 20th century that allowed a handful of corporations to begin consolidating power in the farm sector, and how did those early advantages compound over time?
Thanks. That's a great question. I'm glad you're starting with the history because it's so important. And there were key moments in the early 20th century where we can look to see the initial rise of corporate dominance in the agricultural input sector. And I would put those moments as some major technological changes that happened around the turn of the century. One of those was the movement from the mechanical reapers that were initially invented around the 1830s and 1840s, but they were upgraded to become petrol-powered tractors in the early 1900s. That was really important. Then there was also a shift from the use of natural materials as fertilizer to the production of synthetic forms of nitrogen. And that happened again around the early 1900s. We also saw in the 1920s the scientific developments for the hybridization of seeds. So we went from just selecting seeds for certain traits to actually making them higher yield kind of varieties. And then there was also the rise of organic chemistry, and that gave rise to synthetic pesticides that came along in the 1930s and 40s. So I would say these technological changes were really pivotal moments that gave the firms in these sectors some advantages. And these technological advantages were often protected by patents, which gave those firms some intellectual property protection. But it also combined with other factors that enabled them to get really large in this period. So in that period, it was a time of not that dissimilar to today, where we have quite a great deal of inequality in the economy, but also a rise of large dominant firms because there was a lack of policy to prevent that from happening, even though there were some rules on the books in North America that wasn't very successful in stopping the rise of these big firms because they were able to benefit from that patent protection, but also economies of scale and privileged access to finance and financiers that enabled them to basically buy up their rivals. And they also benefited from certain kinds of government supports and subsidies. So together, these sort of technological, economic, and policy factors combined to enable just a handful of firms to become very large and powerful. And today, when we look at the sector and see those firms dominating over the sector, many of those firms today, you can trace their lineage back to these early companies that initially rose to power after these major technological changes. So yeah, sorry for a bit of a long answer there, but it's a great question because we need to understand that history if we want to understand corporate power and dominance in the sector today.
Professor, the book reveals that just a few corporations control the lion's share of $100 billion market in farm machinery, fertilizer, seeds, and pesticides. Can you walk us through the scale of this concentration? Which corporations dominate each sector? And what does this level of market control actually mean for farmers globally?
Right. When we look today at across these sectors you mentioned, farm machinery, fertilizers, seeds, and pesticides, it's indeed the case that just a handful of firms control the lion's share of those markets. And economists typically say when the top four companies control more than 40% of the market, we get into a territory where market distortions and harms are likely to occur. So when we look, for example, at farm machinery, we know that the top four firms control around 45% of the global market for farm machinery. And those firms are John Deere, CNH Industrial, AGCO, and Kubota. And what's important to recognize is that while we see this global scale concentration, if we look domestically, like within countries, that concentration can be even more pronounced. So, for example, John Deere alone controls 50% of the North American tractor market. And it's a similar story in many, many countries that the concentration can be even more pronounced. When we look at fertilizer, this is an interesting sector because it's less concentrated on a global scale and more concentrated domestically. But in terms of fertilizer, and it's also a complicated sector because it's including nitrogen as synthetic nitrogen, as well as phosphorus and potash. But the big companies that control at the global scale are one's called Nutrien. It's a Canadian company. Another is Yara, based in Scandinavia. Mosaic, which is a North American company, and CF Industries, another North American company. And globally, they control around a quarter of the pesticide, or sorry, the fertilizer market. But again, when you look at the national level, it's way more concentrated. So in North America, just four companies control 100% of the potash. Two firms control 75% of the nitrogen in North America. So it's very, very concentrated. And it's a similar case. I was looking up India, for example, and in the phosphorus market, a huge concentration of just a couple of firms. In the seed industry, we have the big four players are Bayer, the German company, Corteva, based in the US, Syngenta, and BASF, which is a German company. And they control around 50% of the global seed market. Again, domestically, much more concentrated in North America and in many other countries like Brazil and South Africa. Around 80% of maize seed is controlled by just four firms. And in North America, they control around 90% of the intellectual property for genetically modified seeds. And then in pesticides, this is, again, we're talking about insecticides, herbicides, fungicides. The same companies that control seeds control in this sector. So that's Bayer, Corteva, Syngenta, and BASF. And they control 61% of the market. So it's very concentrated, it's uneven, it's in many cases more concentrated at the national level. But you did ask, like, what does this mean for farmers? As I said, anything over 40% can lead to market distortions. And what I argue in the book is that that concentration gives certain kinds of power to the dominant firms where they have market power to shape the market. And this is, most economists would agree, these high degrees of concentration give those firms access to market power. But I argue that they have other kinds of power too that come with it. They have the power to shape technology. They have the power to shape policy. And so what it means for farmers is it is often leading not just to them having to pay higher prices, but it's kind of undercutting their agency and their choice. And it also has big ecological consequences. Because of the kind of technology power they have. And maybe we can talk a little bit more about that, but it definitely has an impact, which is what drove me to write the book in the first place, because I was trying to connect all these dots.
Professor, you highlight how mergers and acquisitions have been central to corporate expansion and consolidation. Can you give us concrete examples of pivotal mergers that shape today's agriculture landscape and how have regulatory frameworks either enabled or failed to prevent this consolidation?
Right. It's a great question. And this is, in many ways, the recent mergers are the reason I decided to write this book, because I was watching them unfold. So the most recent ones in the sector, we could start maybe 10 years ago with a merger of Dow and DuPont in 2015. And that was a $130 billion deal where these two separate companies in the US that both were producing seeds and chemicals decided to merge. This led to a quick succession of other mergers. So one was um, the purchase of Syngenta, which is a Swiss company, by ChemChina, the Chinese chemical company, which was then further bought by or merged into Sinochem. But that original deal that took place in 2016 was around $44 billion, so quite big. And then this was followed by Bayer's purchase of Monsanto, which was a $66 billion deal. And then what was interesting to me, and the reason I wrote not just about seeds and chemicals, but also about fertilizer and machinery, was this additional merger taking place in the midst of all this, which was two of the biggest fertilizer companies, Agrium and Potash Corporation, merged to form Nutrien in 2016 in a $36 billion merger. So again, like really big mergers. When you add them all up, we're talking hundreds of billions of dollars. And it was leading to increased, more pronounced concentration. So this was sort of what drove me to look into this issue, but I quickly realized in doing the research that there's also mergers going on like every day, the smaller ones where these big giants are also buying up startup companies. And that's the interesting part of the story is they're all getting into digital technology right now. So they're buying up genome editing companies for synthetic biology. They're buying up startup companies in digital agriculture, sensors and cameras and et cetera. And so we're seeing kind of this churn where these companies are getting bigger and bigger and more complex. But you ask sort of like, in a way, why is this happening? What's driving it? I mean, it's kind of the combination of shareholder pressure on the companies. We're seeing this increasingly with the rise of ownership of many companies by asset management firms like BlackRock and Vanguard, et cetera. And these shareholders are putting pressure on these firms to drive profit and returns for the investors. And so this has been putting pressure on these companies to get bigger and bigger because they're trying to capture efficiencies and drive profits. It's also that kind of scramble for technological promise of these new technologies, as I mentioned, digital and genome editing. And also, we could add into that mix a weakening of antitrust rules or competition enforcement, especially since the 1980s. We've seen a bit of a stepping back. Um, I mentioned that in the early 1900s, those policies were weak. Well, they had been strengthened after that time, but then they were weakened again after the 1980s. So like it's a combination of factors that have encouraged these companies to get bigger and bigger. But it's an ongoing story, and it's interesting because Corteva just announced a couple weeks ago that they're actually going to split their seed and pesticide units. So, yeah, it's an interesting time. We'll see what develops.
Professor, how have technological innovations from mechanization to synthetic fertilizers to genetically modified seeds created what you call a lock-in of industrial agriculture? Once farmers adopt these technologies, what makes it so difficult for them to transition away?
Yeah, so lock-ins, it's a great question because lock-ins are really central to the argument in the book because they benefit companies when farmers are locked into buying their products. But lock-ins, technically, we can define them as instances when technologies and practices and policies get stuck in a certain pathway, even though it's well known that those technologies, practices, and policies can cause harm. And so a lock-in means it's simply difficult to deviate from that pathway, and in fact, when a lock-in is present, there's actually a downside to those that stray from that pathway. So this is called in the literature, it's called the increasing returns to adoption. It's like the more people adopt it, the more it makes sense for everyone to adopt it because that's where everyone's going. And if you deviate from that path, you're actually at a disadvantage. And this is sometimes referred to also as a technological treadmill, that sort of keeps moving and farmers can't get off. So I argue in the book that we're seeing these kind of technological lock-ins within and across industrial agriculture, and the firms are benefiting from these kind of processes. And in fact, they're encouraging it. But how it emerged I would argue in the first place is when we saw that pivotal change of the rise of tractors, for example, this encouraged farmers to want to work larger tracts of land because if they're going to spend a lot of money on a tractor, it makes sense to use it to its fullest, and that would mean to use a larger plot of land. And so once farmers were using a larger plot of land and maybe using a tractor, they were interested in growing monocultures because it would just be more efficient with the equipment. But once they were doing large tracts of land and wanting to have monocultures, they had a demand for hybrid seeds or high yield varieties, simply because they're in the early case, they were easier to use with harvesting machinery because they had, corn, for example, had stiffer stalks and all the ears appeared at the same height. It was just easier to harvest it mechanically. And so then you've had this mixture, all of a sudden you've got larger land tracts, monocultures, hybrid seeds, and those hybrid seeds were often planted close together, and this could deplete the soil's nutrients, and so they required heavy doses of fertilizer. But when you have all of this going on together, right, you've now got the larger tracts of land, the monoculture, the hybrids, the fertilizers, this makes fields susceptible to pests, and that leads to a greater demand for chemical pesticides. So you can see all of these technologies tended to articulate with one another, and they kind of rolled out. And, this process happened in North America around the 1930s and 40s when this sort of um, transition over to this kind of tractor and industrial model really took hold, and now it's kind of spreading globally. But it's locked these inputs together in a way that has really benefited the companies, and it's very difficult to unwind those lock-ins once they've started. And so that's a big issue or challenge. If we want to curb corporate power, it requires breaking the lock-ins.
Typically, beyond market forces, what role have government policies and subsidies played in enabling corporate consolidation? Are there specific policy decisions that, in retrospect, accelerated or entrenched corporate power in agriculture?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up this question of government subsidies and policies because we can't understate the role that government policies have played in this process because it's not just simply a market dynamic, right? The governments are always, making policies that shape markets and regulating markets. And we've also often seen governments across all sectors intervening in a way with subsidies in order to pick winners because they want to have successful industries that do well in the global marketplace. And this is certainly the case in agriculture as well. And in the case of agriculture, if we look at the US, which was really, I argue, one of the origins of the sort of early rise of industrial agricultural models, the U.S. government invested enormous sums into agricultural R&D through their land grant college system, dating way back to the 1800s. And this was done largely for national security reasons and to ensure livelihoods for the settlers who were, taking over the land. And in many cases, they were displacing indigenous peoples to spread their farms further to the west. But there was this desire on the part of the state to enable farmers to have crops to grow, including for export. And so an example of this was the US government investing heavily in corn hybridization, for example. Um, and through all the way through the 1920s and 30s, the development of this hybrid varieties of corn was a government project, but then it was more or less picked up by the industries and taken away from the government, and then the industries benefited from the research that the government put in place. So that's one example, but this has happened across many of these sectors. So fertilizer is another one where because nitrogen technology was important for national security again because it can be used in bomb making. synthetic nitrogen, it was really important to many governments to have the technology to be able to synthesize nitrogen. And so this these technologies, once they were acquired, and this is a long story, were developed in Germany and in other places as well. But then when the U.S. gets their hands on it, they hand it over to the industry. And the same thing with chemical pesticides. And there's a long history, just to come back to fertilizers for a minute, a long history of government involvement in cartels for the fertilizer trade. And so governments have long had a really strong interest in these different industries and in many ways have given a leg up or an advantage to those dominant firms and let them get even bigger.
Professor, you emphasize that corporate dominance has generated enormous social, ecological, and health impacts. Can you articulate the specific harms to farmers, rural communities, soil health, biodiversity, and food systems that have resulted from this concentration of power?
Yeah, and this was a question that I really thought a lot about in the course of writing the book, because these costs of corporate dominance are huge, but they're not always um, easy to draw the straight line between the company and the consequence, right? So I thought a lot about how this was happening because I really sensed that these problems were connected to that corporate power. And so this is where I link them through these different kinds of power that the firms have. Because as they get bigger and more concentrated, and I mentioned this already, they gain access to market power, basically lets them shape the supply and demand aspects of markets. They get a kind of technology power where they get so big that their decisions about technology tend to um, carry the day and shape what technological trajectories look like. And they have that kind of political power where they're so big they can lobby governments and, fund science and do all kinds of stuff that influences what agriculture looks like. So in terms of the broader costs of this industrial model, I do think it's quite connected to this question of corporate power. So for example, market power, we know it's associated with higher prices, for example, higher prices for inputs that face farmers, but that translates to higher food prices as well for consumers. Um, we also know that market power keeps small scale enterprises out of the marketplace because market power is about amassing all of, control of the market, and it makes it very difficult, creates barriers to entry, so to speak, for smaller players to get into the market. And so when we have fewer small scale enterprises, we have less diverse livelihoods and more inequality. So market power is associated with a lot of these costs. And then the technology power, I think, leads to other kinds of costs. So as we see technology becoming more and more sophisticated, we're seeing farmers losing skills. They have lost skills of how to naturally deal with pests. They've lost many skills about seed selection, for example, because everything is kind of taken over by the firms. And then they end up having less autonomy and less choice because the firms are basically selling them a certain kind of technological package. And it becomes very difficult, for example, to um, find heritage seeds on the market when basically the big companies are dominating. And the technologies they're offering, such as genetic modification, where we know that seeds are working with certain herbicides, this has led to increased herbicide use globally with the rise of genetically modified crops. And there's all kinds of health and environmental consequences that arise from that. We know that the focus on heavily mechanized farming is associated with fossil fuel use as well as greenhouse gases and the carbon footprint of agriculture. And also this technological lock-ins we were just talking about makes it harder to transition to more sustainable forms of farming. And then we get, add to that one more kind of power, which is the political power. When corporations have that ability to dominate in governance spaces, it can weaken the voices of the most marginalized people in society, and that is a big consequence. It risks undermining democracy and entrenching inequalities. So I know it's a huge and overwhelming list of consequences, but they all can be traced back to this problem of corporate dominance and concentration in the market. And when we look at the agricultural inputs sector specifically, because one could do this kind of analysis at any point in the food system, and I wanted to really ground it in a specific example, that those linkages become really clear.
But Jennifer, what pressures do small and medium-sized farmers face when they are dependent on a handful of corporations for seeds, fertilizers, and equipment? Are there regions or countries where the dynamic is particularly acute?
Yeah, well, the concentration and consolidation of power really matters for farmers, especially because farmers are increasingly relying on the big firms for their inputs, whereas they used to source them on the farm. So in the book, I talk about um, the commodification of these inputs in the first place because many of them were reproduced on the farm. The seeds were selected by farmers. They were using natural fertilizers. They were controlling pests, with natural um, methods of, cultivation and other kinds of landscape changes. Um, a- a- and when we saw this sort of commodification of these kinds of inputs, farmers have then become reliant on an outside source. So again, it results in them losing some autonomy and having a higher cost of doing business. And I would argue that this has contributed to pressures to larger size land holdings because the industrial model tends to be more, and again, air quotes, efficient on larger scale farms. And this can mean some farmers, and it did mean many farmers lost their access to land because they had to sell, because they would have to go into debt in order to be able to afford to buy the inputs. Um, and so, as this process has happened, it's created all kinds of consequences. And we've seen that with, for example, um, in the modern era, we see the machinery companies don't want farmers to be able to fix their own machines because they say the sophisticated software is under copyright protection, and therefore it's only the companies themselves that can repair the machines. Again, that's like a clear example of farmers losing that kind of autonomy, but also having to pay more. And there's lots of practices like companies giving loyalty payments to retailers who refuse to sell generic products. Again, that's forcing the farmers to buy the more expensive varieties. So this kind of consequence for farmers, I think, is very real of this kind of concentration. And for some farmers, the ones that are producing goods, for example, that go into global supply chains, they're often squeezed on both ends of this dynamic because they're buying inputs from a few companies, but they can only sell their products to a few companies too. And their bargaining power gets shrunken when they're facing powerful actors on either side of them. So you asked, are there countries or regions where this is acute? I would say it's happening everywhere, but we can see especially that being squeezed on both ends. We see that with many farmers producing goods that, fruits and vegetables that go into global, grocery stores and global supply chains. But we also see it in dairy, we see it in livestock. There are many parts of the food system where these kind of, um, really squeezed, farmers are feeling very squeezed in that kind of a way. And I would say that this spread of this industrial agricultural model as well is encompassing more and more farmers who are becoming reliant on the market. So I do think it's something we have to be aware of because it's shrinking the space farmers have for maneuver and it's weakening their bargaining power.
Professor, you examine recent efforts to address corporate power in food systems. What are the most promising alternatives or resistance movement you have encountered, whether agroecological approaches, farmer cooperatives, policy interventions, or other innovations, and what are their prospects for scaling?
Yeah, it's a great question. What do we do about these problems? Um, I would argue that we actually need a host of measures to address corporate power in food systems. I don't think there's any one policy that's going to do everything. But that's what makes it more complicated because it requires political will across a number of actors and across a number of scales. But I'll give a sense of, what I think needs to happen. And you mentioned agroecology and farmers cooperatives, and I do think that those kind of alternatives, like if we want farmers to um, shift into other kinds of production, we need a model for them to look to. And agroecology is one, farmer cooperatives is another, and also this idea or concept of territorial markets, which is really referring to sort of local and regional markets. They don't necessarily have to be within one country, they can span a border, but it's markets that are more connected to a territory. And these are the kinds of spaces in agriculture and food systems that are less reliant on dominant firms. And they give farmers a place to pursue their livelihoods in a context that's outside of the industrial model, that's outside the corporate model. And if we don't have those spaces, there's, the challenge is even bigger. And the good news is we have those spaces. The good news is that, in fact, in the global south, most people are actually fed through these kind of alternative markets and alternative production systems. Less so in the global north, in the industrialized world, where we have more reliance on the industrial system. But there are also still, farmers markets and agroecological movements. So those are really important. And I would argue here that we need more public support for these spaces. So in many contexts, territorial markets, for example, are, policies don't favor those kind of contexts because there are all these complicated rules around, maybe food safety, which of course is really important, but we don't want to set rules that actually discourage people from wanting to do small scale food production, for example. Um, and we need more support and research and development into agroecological farming practices. So I think that's important, but I don't think that alone is going to do it because, as I said, there's no one solution. But we need to add to it other things. So one of those would be stronger competition policies, right? Where um, there are better rules to oversee, because when companies want to merge and acquire each other, they have to get permission from governments. And governments have been largely allowing these kind of mergers to happen, and partly because those laws have been weakened in recent decades, but they need to be made stronger so that there's more oversight. And when companies do get big, want to get bigger through mergers, and also more oversight when they get so big they have an unfair monopoly, right? They need to be in many cases, some cases, broken up when they get too big. Um, but again, that on its own won't do it because we also we also need to have policies to undo the corporate capture of food systems. Because when corporations have that kind of political power to shape policy and governance, it makes it really hard to pass policies to strengthen competition policy. It makes it harder to have policies to support agroecology. So for me, ish, actions in all three of those areas need to happen. And we could, add more, but we don't have all day. But, we have to deal with unequal land holdings, inequality in society more broadly, this whole corporate corporate contributions to political campaigns, et cetera. We could go on and on. But I think we do need to strategize on a like a bigger scale. And some of those changes need to happen even outside of food systems themselves. Like stronger competition policy is an issue for the economy as a whole, as is tackling the question of corporate influence in policy making. So, yeah, it's a bit of an onion approach where we need all kinds of layers of action if we want to fully address the problem.
Professor, given the historical entrenchment of industrial agriculture and the structural advantages these corporations possess, what are the major barriers to meaningful change? Is transformation of the current system realistically possible, or are we locked into this trajectory?
Yeah, I think this is like the $1 million question. So I'm glad you put it on the list. Um, the Yeah, the large and dominant firms definitely, as I said already, can influence policy and governance in ways that make regulation very, very difficult to implement. We're seeing this in real time right now in the world, especially as we're seeing the rise of big tech companies, for example, and it's on full display in the United States, where we see the big tech titans attending, important fancy dinners and they get more airplay than average folks. And so their viewpoints get more pickup in government. Um, and for this reason, I think this idea of transformation in food systems is really essential. I don't think we can tinker around the edges with policy because it's too easy to stop policy. What we need is a bigger groundswell of support coming from not just government, but communities, social movements, farmer organizations, average people, we need to demand transformative change if we want to get past and challenge the power of the big firms. And there's been some interesting developments in recent years, I would say. There's been a wider movement to address corporate power more broadly. So again, not just in agriculture, but the big tech companies in particular. We've seen a push in the pharmaceutical industry. There's been I would say a bit of a groundswell of support to push back against the kind of lack of fairness that people have seen in the economy tied to corporate power. I mean, young people today, if they want to go, at least in North America, if you graduating university and want to get a job, like there's actually not a lot of choice because you're basically looking at, a job with a big company like Amazon or Google, et cetera. But there has been a bit of a push to push back against this. We saw more of this under the Biden administration in the US, where there was a rise of something called the neo-Brandisian movement of antitrust. And basically, that's referring to um, Brandeis, who was a Supreme Court justice in the early um, 20th century, who was a big champion of tackling corporate power. And he said early, as early as 1914, corporate power is a threat to democracy. And so this movement was really sort of saying we need to get back to those kind of principles and understand the threat that corporate power plays. And in that context, under the Biden administration, he had appointed some really progressive neo-Brandisian types into his administration in the Federal Trade Commission, who actually did tighten some of the rules on mergers. So the merger control guidelines were improved in late 2024, just before everything changed. And that happened in Canada as well. And I know they're having these discussions in the EU, and I'm less sure about what's happening in India around this question, but and I'd love to hear more about it. But I think there has been a recognition that corporate power writ large is a problem for society. Um, but the issue with that is we've seen, since the Trump administration took over in 2025, at least in the US, there's been more of a return to more transactional kinds of decision making. There have been some results from court cases, like there was one yesterday where Meta won its case that the FTC had tried to sue it for having a monopoly, and they won that case. But yeah, it's been a bit of hit and miss in terms of where we're headed right now. But I do think that we we need to sort of capture the energy of that kind of better competition policy and combine it with the social movements that are really, coming from the ground up for farmers, calling for food sovereignty, calling for agroecology, calling for territorial, you know, economies. And in a way, if we can merge these movements, I think it could be quite powerful in trying to affect change. But I do think, you know, the challenges you mentioned are really real. The corporate power is real. The lock-in problem is real. But if the movements are strong enough, I do think that they can make that system budge and that we can work our way towards a better and more sustainable food system.
Professor, I would like to conclude this episode with one last question. Looking ahead, what gives you hope about the future of food systems? What would it take in terms of policy, consumer demand, technological innovation, or farmer mobilization for us to move forward a more diversified, resilient, and equitable agriculture system?
Yeah, well, I'm glad you asked this question, Deepak. But if I'm honest, I would say I had more hope a year ago than I do now, simply because of the big changes we've seen on a global scale in the past year. We've seen big geopolitical shifts. We've seen also political shifts away from addressing climate change. We've seen increased conflict and little action addressing the big inequalities and maybe a bit of a stalling in terms of addressing corporate power. But having said that and looking at this sort of big geopolitical change in the world, I still believe that we can uh, and we must affect a major transformation in the agricultural sector if we want to break the lock-ins and resist that corporate power. I think we really we can't just sit back and assume individual farmers or individual consumers will just magically change their practices. Um, because we said that's a good idea. I don't think that's enough to bring about transformation. We really need that policy change as well. And I would just, yeah, like to sort of re-emphasize the point that in the past, states like governments really did step up to invest in agriculture. They've stepped back in recent years with the rise of neoliberal economic policies and a retrenchment of the state. We have seen less of that kind of investment. But I do think even though we're in, strange economic times, there could be a financial crisis around the corner. We don't know, but it is a moment when states do need to step up and invest in a more sustainable food system. Um, and we need to support producers. We need to support the farmers because we can't, as I said, we can't put all the costs of a transformation onto farmers themselves. It needs to be part of a broader social movement and effort of a wider range of people, including those kind of policy measures to rein in corporate power and influence. But I do think I have to have hope because I wake up every day thinking we can make this case better. We can, make the case and build the movement. And so every day we have to work towards it because we really have no choice. We are seeing food systems careening towards a really unsustainable future if we don't do something dramatic and transformative. And so I think if we want to have this sustainable food security on a global scale, we do have to really bring about that transformation, and we simply have to work on it every day. And so you asked, what gives me hope about it? I think the hope is the essentiality, it's essential. So we simply have to do it. But I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Dr. Jennifer Clapp, for bringing clarity to such a complex and consequential issue. Your research shows that change is possible and that knowledge is power. We hope our listeners leave today inspired to think differently about where their food comes from and what it takes to transform our food systems. Thank you once again for joining with us today.
Thank you so much, Deepak. It's been a pleasure to be on your show today.